Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Tomasz Koper, sitting in for Divya Gopalan. Which countries come to mind when you hear the word colonialism? For many, it's the 19th century, Western European powers, or the United States. But ask a Ukrainian or an indigenous Siberian and you might find that a different country altogether tops the list of colonial associations. In today's episode, we will be exploring Russian colonialism, its legacy, and the reasons why this issue flies under the radar in so many places around the world. And to help us along, we welcome Aurora Chang in Taipei and Maksym Eristavi in Prague in the Czech Republic. Maksym, you described yourself as a Russian colonialism storyteller-in-chief. And you also have a rule on your podcast that Ukrainians introduce themselves. So I'm going to let you talk about who you are and what you do.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here and especially talk about this topic more. I'm a Ukrainian journalist. This topic for me that I've been trying to mainstream for almost a decade is deeply personal. Because I come from very mixed family, and I had so many questions always about my identity, who I am, where I come from, and I never had many answers for that, and I never knew why. So, for example, why I speak Russian as a kid, and the entire my family speaks Ukrainian. Why we were missing so many family members. And most importantly, why there are so many answers to my questions. And with time, I understood that there is a power, there is a bigger system that basically constantly, generation after generation, erases Ukrainian voices, erases our stories, and we don't know much about who we are, first and foremost, just because of those centuries of cultural and political, economical erasure. And unfortunately, a year and a half ago, another genocide started in my homeland, targeting my family, taking away my friends and the family members. And I felt compelled that this is the time to end the cycle and to shame the empire and to expose it as much as possible.
And Aurora, could you also tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Hi, thank you for having me. So I am not Ukrainian, I am Taiwanese, and I have been an organizer with Taiwan Stands With Ukraine since the beginning of the full-scale invasion last year. I think my connection with this topic kind of comes in that I studied history, politics, and economics of Eastern Europe and Russia in uni. And then I also currently and have worked with many other different, decolonial, anti-colonial movements since I graduated. I currently work for the International Tibet Network, and I am also part of, a grassroots kind of news organization called New Bloom.
Maksym, I want to kind of draw on this experience you have as the storyteller-in-chief of colonialism and ask you, could you tell us what the main features of Russian colonialism are as opposed to other forms of colonialism that are more talked about internationally?
I think, of course, there are different types of colonialisms out there. And definitely Russian one has many unique features. Maybe that's why it's the only colonial empire in the oldest form still surviving, because they were so great at preserving themselves. But I think there's a couple of similar things that exist that kind of help you to see it as a colonial empire. And the first, important thing for any type of colonialism is not so much the land conquest or pillage of resources. It's first and foremost about the so-called triumph of colonialism that happens in the identities and the minds of colonized people. So what do I mean by this? I mentioned my mixed background and that I was raised speaking Russian in my Ukrainian-speaking family. And a part of the reason why it happened, because my parents thought that I will have more opportunities in life speaking Russian, because in our environment, even when I was already was brought up when Ukraine regained independence in 1991, anything Russian, Russian language, Russian culture, anything connected to metropole was considered as superior, as something that will provide you with better opportunities in life. And speaking Ukrainian would absolutely marginalize you, because people thought that being Ukrainian, speaking Ukrainian culture was something to be ashamed of, something undeveloped, something uncivilized. So this component is the result of Russia's policies of Russification and assimilation. And I think it's one of the most important kind of marks on the region where Russia was as a colonial power, and it's something that connects many of us. There are other types, of course, you don't know so much about Russian colonialism just because when assimilation didn't work, Russia straight out genocides people and kills whoever they can kill, as you can see in today's Ukraine.
Well, speaking of places that have been under the influence of the Russian colonial empire, countries like Ukraine, Kazakhstan, the Baltic nations, and others all gained independence after the fall of the Soviet Union. But there are still many republics and ethnic regions that are a part of Russia. Let's take a look at this map. Russia, a country occupying 11% of the world's landmass, proclaims its anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist. So let's take a closer look. There are over 24 ethnic regions within Russia, spanning from northern Caucasus through the Ural Mountains to Siberia. Some of them are formally called republics and several more districts. Just like Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the Baltic republics, some of the colonized people tried to gain independence. Chechnya went as far as to fight 2 wars of independence in the 1990s, but to no avail. And this is Sakha, home to the indigenous Turkic-speaking Sakha people, the largest ethnic republic in Russia. In fact, if it were an independent nation, it would be the 8th largest country in the world, just between India and Argentina. And like many vast ethnic regions in Russia, Sakha is fantastically rich in resources. Diamonds, gold, and uranium are among the abundant resources mined here. At the same time, ethnic regions enjoy one of the lowest living standards in the Russian Federation. In many, the original inhabitants are now a minority in their own land, far outnumbered by ethnic Russians resettled there in a recent past. So, Maksym, let me ask you, is there a chance that these regions, these republics that are now part of the Russian Federation will, over time, eventually gain independence, just like Ukraine and other post-Soviet states?
I actually love that you brought that map. I think one of the most interesting, most funniest thing always to point out to people that the country that big, it cannot be just a natural ethnic or national state. It's an empire. When I was putting together my upcoming book, Russian Colonialism 101, which is an illustrated guide just to 50 examples of recent invasions that were following the similar formula that was used in Ukraine, I was shocked to find out how many democracy movements, how many attempts various indigenous nations that are still trapped inside Russia tried and failed, unfortunately, and how many voices and stories were erased, starting from the first Muslim democratic republics inside Russia at the beginning of 20th centuries and ending with horrific crushing of the Chechnya independence, Ichkeria independence movement, as you mentioned. So all these stories, the rest of the world doesn't know much because Russia not only was successful at military conquering these lands, but also at identity erasure and most importantly, at outright genocide. Some of those republics that you mentioned, some of those lands that you mentioned, missing over half or 2/3 of their population because of those horrible genocide and mass murder campaigns that Russia unleashed on them. So I cannot tell you for sure because I'm not representative of those nations, whether they will be independent, but I always say that only partitioned, disarmed, and decolonized Russia is the only peace plan that will work. Otherwise, if that won't happen, then these endless cycles of violence and invasions and conquests will be just keeping on as they've been doing for the last several hundred years.
And Aurora, in light of all that, like there are so many regions, so many republics, so many nations, so many peoples that are experiencing this Russian colonialism. Why does it get a pass? Why is it flying under the radar throughout most of Europe and most of North America, at least?
Just the discussion of colonialism and decolonization is still actually relatively recent, and even more recent is the attempts by non-Western scholars to kind of push for the understanding of empire, of colonizer, to powers that aren't traditionally considered part of the Western world. In academia, and sometimes in activism even, there's this strange misconception that for a power, for any force to be colonial or imperialistic, it must inherently be Western, which I don't think is true, but it's the assumption that a lot of activists and scholars that I've seen kind of operate on. And that's why countries like Russia and China currently, which are occupying several nations and which are committing cultural genocide and literal genocide against peoples living under occupation, get a pass in academia, in activism, in social movements. It's really a blind spot, I would say, and like Maksym said, it's really strange because countries like that don't get so massive by being peaceful, decolonial, anti-Western powers. Yeah.
Well, let's listen to one more voice explaining this phenomenon of the invisible Russian colonialism. Historian Botakos Kasimbekova has been researching the legacy of the Russian Empire and its colonization efforts. The assistant professor of modern history at the University of Basel in Switzerland explained how Western scholars overlook the issue.
One of the books that I'm writing right now and co-authoring it with Kimberly St. Julian Vernon, and the book is titled Imperial Innocence, is to look at the narratives and mechanisms to blind not only people in Russia, but also people in ex-colonies to that coloniality. This is something that has not been written about. The academic, more or less, consensus was that the Soviet Union was something great for people in Central Asia, especially people who look at the Soviet Union as this communist promise, try to criticize American capitalism and imperialism and take the Soviet Union as a proof that communism is a better social system, that communism achieved equality. These people would, when you talk about coloniality, then you are very easily and quickly accused in nationalism. So this is one of the reasons it is, for example, very difficult to talk about the hunger in Kazakhstan, because every time you talk about the genocide, it is not accepted as genocide. It's very difficult to be outspoken. So I decided to do it for myself because it was too painful to talk about it publicly and then be accused of not being grateful to Russians, not being grateful to the Soviet system. So people would say, you are what you are because you've been raised in the Soviet Union. Studying the archival material, I thought that this is my mission now, to tell the truth about the Soviet past.
So, Maksym, is there a way to undo this way of thinking that non-Western countries cannot be colonial empires?
I'm actually super glad you feature both Aurora and Botakos, because this is exactly what we've been doing at the Ukrainian Spaces podcast as well. Because for us, it was important to feature so many of our friends and allies for the simple reason, because so many of them went through their experience of being colonized or descendants of colonization in other parts of the world that is not the West. And when we get together and we share our stories, our personal stories, what it means to be a survivor of colonial violence or of our descendants or our history of our countries, there's so many powerful moments of connection. We understand that we went through similar things despite being so different from such a different places on Earth. There is no sure way to say how to end the cycle, but I definitely think that more space and more platform for indigenous voices that actually have this intimate knowledge what Russian colonialism does and how it operates is paramount. Unfortunately, we still don't have those voices platformed and mainstreamed. They are still marginalized up until, unfortunately, the start of genocide in Ukraine. You cannot imagine how many influential, powerful people and mainstream and establishment people in the West would laugh to my face when I would mention Russian colonialism as a concept. Now, this awareness, this education through the voices, indigenous voices, through amplifying their stories is becoming more and more common. Unfortunately, Ukraine pays a horrible price every day. So this attention, this spotlight is on Russia. But I think there are centuries of this propaganda, Russian propaganda, has to be undone. It won't happen in a day, but I'm overjoyed to see that there are more mainstream conversation such as this one is happening, and we can talk about it without the Russian filter, without Moscow filter, and without Western filter, to be honest.
Well, speaking of that, Aurora, do you think that given its unique position, Taiwan has a better understanding of, or more nuanced rather, understanding of colonialism than Europeans or North Americans?
I think Taiwanese people definitely can sympathize and understand that sort of thing, but I'm not sure whether the colonial framing necessary is something that, say my friends from school, like from high school, would necessarily use to understand this sort of thing. But I do think that given our position, given our history and relationship with China as it is now, and given like the many, I guess, surface level similarities between what Russia is doing to Ukraine and what China has been doing to, for example, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, Uyghurs, and what China is threatening to do to Taiwan. Taiwan is a really great environment to foster these kind of conversations.
I would like to take our attention back to Ukraine because there are few places in the world where the legacy of Russian colonial thinking is as obvious as in Ukraine. Many say that Russian actions over the last 3 decades show that the country's leadership still does not see Ukrainians as a sovereign nation. We asked scholar and volunteer Mariana Savchenko, an Ukrainian history researcher and the director of Taiwan Trade Center in Kyiv, Xu Yuxuan, about their opinions on the topic.
I was born still in the Soviet Union, but I've grown up in the independent Ukraine. Although, of course, this legacy have been with us for centuries. As we know, Russia has been a huge colonial power since the Russian Empire, and then during the Soviet times as well. We still don't view it as the Soviet colonialism purely, of course, because the driving force of that was Russian colonialism. So they kind of transformed the imperial past into the Soviet agenda.
If you study a bit history of both Ukraine and Taiwan, you can find many similarities and parallels. For example, both Taiwan and Ukraine have been under rule of dual empires. My grandparents, they were born in the Japanese colonial rule times. So they were born as Japanese. They spoke Japanese. And as for my parents' generation, they're under the rule of KMT rules. So they have to speak Mandarin only. So that is why people in my generation, we started to learn how to be a Taiwanese. So you can say that we are still now in the process of searching our own national identity.
So the full-scale invasion probably was the most obvious and significant sign of the presence of this colonialism still, right? That Russia has never given up on Ukraine. They desire to eliminate, to erase the identity of Ukrainians, to rewrite the history.
So, Maksym, Mariana said that after centuries of Russification, one of the biggest challenges for the Ukrainian society is finding its own identity. What kind of issues does the Ukrainian society have to overcome to get close to that goal?
I think there is no challenge at the moment. I think every Ukrainian is quite sure about who we are and our identity. And I think maybe if we don't have enough time to flesh out the exact concepts or how we talk about it, just because people are busy of literally surviving. And I think the more important issue is the issue of decolonization, because what it means practical terms. We feel and we know that we're Ukrainians, but what it means to establish what it means for ourselves, we need to be connected to our roots, to our history, to know where we come from. And Russia has been extremely good at erasing and destroying all that evidence. So for you, it's very hard to connect not only with your history to establish all the facts, right, to connect with your cultural background, because Russia has been slaughtering and killing all your artists and writers and, destroying the books. The village I come from southern Ukraine, is now under temporary occupation. So the first thing that Russians did in our village when they entered is they went to archives and our libraries in the villages, and they burned all the Ukrainian language books and they destroyed the archives. And this is not the first time that it has happened to our village. During previous Russian invasions, they did the same, to kind of exterminate any traces of authenticity, so they can bring their Russian books and their version of history and their language to replace it. And I think these constant cycles of erasure and violence, they only happen because there is no justice served, and Russia has been punished for any of it, not only in Ukraine, but as we mentioned, to hundreds of nations, and some of the nations that they destroyed and eliminated entirely, and we never talk about them. So once the justice served, it's going to be important for us to focus that Russia is held accountable for these crimes. But for us, for people who survived the Russian colonialism, it's the job only starts to reconnect with our roots, reestablish our past, learn more about the voices that were been erased. So this is a job that unfortunately will probably continue forever, just because of so much damage has been done. However, this, I think, is the most important mission for many Ukrainians personally or as a nation. I wish we just have the time and resources not being slaughtered to do that in peace.
Well, we are unfortunately quickly running out of time, but before we go, I would like to ask Aurora one last question. Looking at Ukraine right now and the full-scale invasion by Russia, what do you think Taiwanese and Ukrainians can learn from each other, given their similar situations in a way?
I think that one thing that I have learned a lot already myself as a Taiwanese person from Ukrainians is really resilience and a lot of on the ground tactics, like civil defense. Like the idea that civil defense is important is something I think that has really risen in Taiwan since the full-scale invasion. And then I think another thing is how to speak to the world, how to engage with a world that, even though it has like wrought so much injustice upon you, you keep on keeping on. Basically, you keep talking and speaking out and making sure that your presence is known, so that you can. I mean, this is how you preserve your culture in the face of cultural genocide, in the face of like a power that seeks to, like Maksym said, exterminate you. So I think Taiwan faces similar dynamics with China. Not obviously, the history is still different, but there are a lot of parallels that you can draw. And I think I really hope that if anything horrible happens, that we can rise to the occasion and respond the way Ukrainians have.
Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time for today's episode. Thank you to both my guests, Aurora Chang in Taipei and Maksym Eristavi in Prague in the Czech Republic. And we will be looking at other non-Western colonialisms in future episodes, so stay tuned for that. Thank you to our viewers at home. It's been great to have your company. Goodbye and stay connected.